Greetings, Ohio Valley. This is Dan Lima with OSU Extension from Belmont County.
And this is Karen Cox from WVU Extension in Ohio County. Thanks for tuning in to Extension Calling, your source for research-based information for the farm, garden, and home.
Hello, Karen.
Morning, Dan. Another day, another week down.
Another day, another rain.
It's almost June. I cannot believe how fast the year is going. Trying my best to keep up with everything. But we're looking at the beginning or the end of May and the beginning of June. Planting is in full force for field crops and garden crops.
That's right. We got the frost behind us, and we are pedal to the metal.
That's right. So definitely make sure that you're paying attention to any upcoming disease potentialities and watching those insect first sightings so that you can protect your plants in a timely manner.
That's right. A lot of those fungicides now are important, especially for fruit quality. So keep that in mind. And, that's as far as I'm going to go with that, because that could be another show too.
Well, we talked a lot about that kind of stuff last week as far as making sure you're scouting. And this week, we're going to talk about a slightly different type of agriculture. We're going to talk about growing things in the shade through a practice called forest farming.
Slightly different. Just a little
slightly
bit.
Different, yeah. So there's a couple different methodologies for forest farming, and they all kind of forest farming kind of falls under the umbrella term of agroforestry. And so that's agriculture combined with forestry. And so when you're talking about, when you're looking at forest farming, you're looking at a few different aspects of agricultural production. You can do wild simulated, you can do intensive planting, but all of it involves planting in the woods. It's an intentional action though. So, forest farming is the cultivation of high value crops under a forest canopy. So that's a really important aspect of it in that it's the cultivation of those crops and it's not just wild harvesting. And so this is a technique that a lot of forest owners are getting into simply because it allows you to have that income while the forest is maturing. Let's say if you don't have a timber harvest in the next, 60 years, how are you going to get that land to pay for itself so that you can maintain it and keep it from development, right?
Well, and not only pay for itself, but also how do you utilize that land to the best of your ability and to a degree that satisfies your need for using the land and using the property. With forest farming, we are talking about shade-tolerant crops, correct?
Yes, and typically when you're looking at forest farmed crops, you're talking about things like medicinal herbs, mushrooms, mosses, fruits, nuts.
Are we talking lettuce?
No, we're not talking lettuce. We're talking...
So lettuce wouldn't work then for this.
there are some vegetable crops. You can think ramps, right? So ramps could be forest farmed, but I don't think there's quite enough sunlight for lettuce.
Okay.
But probably the most common thing we think of when you're talking forest farming is those sweet liquids, your maple syrup and other tree syrups. That's probably what most people think of when they think of production in a woodlot that can be sold at a farmer's market. But there are a lot of other things that you can grow as well. And there's an increasing amount of information available to you that can help guide you down that particular path.
So does this is kind of new to me, Karen, so I'm going to be asking you questions if that's okay.
No, that's perfect.
All right, so if you're talking, so you got the canopy, right? You got a closed canopy, and I remember we did a show before, and it was kind of, and this is something that Ohio State kind of focused on there for a while, was increasing the amount of oaks as opposed to maples in the forest by opening up some of the canopy to allow more light penetration to then allow those oaks to get better established. So, let's say you're kind of doing that practice and opening up the canopy for oak preferences. At that point, would you also have enough light, let's say, to do something like lettuce?
Well, how many hours of sunlight does lettuce need in a day?
Uh, Lettuce can get by on partial sun and indirect light.
So typically when you're talking about forest farming, you're talking about growing things that have a bit higher value than lettuce. So we're talking about ginseng and goldenseal, black cohosh, bloodroot,
Oh, I see.
Solomon seal, blue cohosh. So these medicinal herbal plants that grow naturally in our woodlands and fetch a fairly high price at market. And so with those crops, you're it's a similar thinking pattern in that you're going to need to have a certain percentage of sunlight that does hit the forest floor. So you're looking for 20% sunlight to get to the floor, so 80% closed canopy. So there's some dappled light that's getting through. I don't think it would be quite enough to do lettuce, but we're talking about some of our native plants that we're actually intentionally growing.
I see.
So depends on how you want to do it too.
And 80% could entail a little bit of opening up the canopy.
Yeah, in a lot of cases you would need a slightly opened canopy. And typically when you're looking at these types of botanicals, you're looking at forest cover types that would include maples and also maybe some poplars, black walnut. Most of it's tied to you want it to be on a north facing slope, slightly more moist, so that they can have the humidity level to allow them to flourish. Whereas when you're talking about oak production, you're talking about those hotter south facing slopes. So when you're looking at your forest management plan for your entire woodlot, you can have different management objectives based on what the natural habitat that's in those woodlands would be.
Okay. And then as I'm thinking about agricultural products that we find in the forest, I think of ginseng. I also think of mushrooms. But, this is a little bit different, I guess, because we're not really cultivating the mushrooms.
Well, you can, though. So mushrooms are kind of a tricky thing, and it really depends on what state you're in because every state has different laws. So in West Virginia, you're not legally allowed to sell wild collected mushrooms. And in order for you to sell mushrooms that are, not your standard typical shiitake or, button mushrooms that you would grow in a farm type atmosphere, you would need to prove that you have identified the right spore through microscopic analysis and then culture out your spores and then inoculate your growing medium, and then you can sell that produced mushroom.
Yeah, and I know wild mushrooms are also illegal to be sold at farmers markets in Ohio as well.
Okay. So now places like Pennsylvania and I believe North Carolina, and I'm not positive on Virginia, so I can't say on that. But I believe those two states at least have like a wild forager's license that you can get where you go through an intensive training program. And once you have that license, then you are enabled to harvest and sell wild collected mushrooms. But that is a state by state thing.
I didn't know that was out there.
Yeah, fun stuff, right? So like if you're wanting to grow mushrooms in your woodlands, you can do log inoculation, you can grow in mulch beds, you can do what's called a totem pole where you layer logs on top of one another and put your spores in between the logs and allow the mycelium to grow in between them all. There are multiple different mushrooms that you can produce in a woodland environment or even just in your backyard. So if you have a nice shady, cool, moist spot. Now, moist doesn't mean wet. So it does still need to be well drained, but you can build a mushroom bed. And that's just one of the many things that we talked about this past weekend. I attended a forest farmers forum, and it was in southern West Virginia. It was a really great time. I met a lot of really great people. And there is another one coming up in June, and that will actually be in southern Ohio. And it will be June 24th through 26th, the Southern Ohio Forest Farming Conference. And to learn more about that, you would go to appalachianforestfarmers.org. And that's really a great website if you are interested in learning about the forest farming initiatives that are going on around the area, AppalachianForestFarmers.org is a fantastic resource. There's reference material, lots of videos, and also links to different learning opportunities. And there's also an opportunity to even have someone come out to your property and help evaluate your woodlands to determine whether or not it would be feasible for you to start a forest farming endeavor. So there are some people that can come out and take a look at your property.
Okay. Yeah, and in fact, one of the things that master gardeners in Belmont County, Ohio, do or have done in the past is we've done some fresh log inoculations because you can get those little inoculant plugs.
Mm-hmm.
And as long as it's a fresh log, you're inoculating it with a very specific mushroom. And by doing so, you have confidence that it is that mushroom and you are working with a mushroom that is edible. But I mean, you can't sell it, but as far as personal consumption goes, it is a nice thing to have. And I know it's completely different from cultivating it in the woods or cultivating it in different manners, but it is something for the home growers, if they're interested, that they can do is, fresh inoculated logs aren't incredibly difficult, but they do require a certain protocol. So if that's something that sounds interesting, there are ways to go about it.
Yeah, and in West Virginia, you can sell mushrooms if you have a identified inoculum and you are following the correct protocols for inoculating your logs and growing them out. You can actually sell those. So that's, again, something you want to make sure you check with your local Department of Agriculture on as to what you're allowed to sell. But once one particular mushroom has spread throughout a log, it is really good at fighting off other mushrooms. They don't like hanging out together. So you can be pretty confident if you have properly inoculated your log that is the mushroom you're going to get out of it. Now, one of the things that turns people off from mushroom production or forest farming in general is the time period, right? So for a shiitake mushroom log, you're looking at least a year, probably closer to 2 to 3 years before you get a harvestable crop to be able to have enough to utilize for a sale or something like that. So there is a time period where you have to allow these things to grow out. When you're talking about, ginseng, you're talking about a good 20-year rotation before you can get a high value crop. Now, there are ways that you can farm these things a little bit more intensively, at least your medicinal herb or your herbal medicinals, where you're going to be cultivating a planting area, tilling it up, and trying to get your plants in more quickly, get them a little bit more sunlight, a little bit more nutrients, and they're going to grow a little bit faster. But when you're talking about things like ginseng, that's actually going to decrease the quality of the root. So you'll have a greater volume, but it'll be a lower quality. And so you have to determine right up front, what is your goal for this and what type of investment are you willing to make? Because ginseng seed is not cheap. And, you're going to have a couple $100s in just seed to go out into your woodland and determine whether or not it's going to be a successful crop for you.
And with ginseng specifically, there are ways to amend the soil to make sure that it has a higher chance of germinating and growing in a successful manner.
So when you're looking at things like ginseng, you're really depends on how you're planning to grow. So if you are wanting to wild simulate, then you're going to be going out into your woodlands and scraping off the uppermost layer of duff, putting your seed down on top of the next layer of duff so you don't actually make full soil contact, and then you cover it up and you have to, put some deer barrier over that, so put some brush on it or something, so that the deer don't eat that baby seedling as soon as it pops up. And then you wait like a year and a half. And then they'll sprout up in the woodlot. And, 3 years later, you're like, oh, look, there is actually ginseng here that I planted, 3 years ago and have thought that it died. Now, if you're wanting to do a more intensive forest farm, then that's when you can prepare a bed and you can plant it in rows just like you would a normal crop. But with ginseng, keep in mind the looser and more nutrient-richer soil, the faster growth is going to be, more volume, but less value. So it's not necessarily, there are some farms that do ginseng that sell, if you buy something on the market that has ginseng in it, that's usually open farmed where the root grows very fast. It looks kind of like a parsnip, and it's not that little wrinkled, bent up, shriveled looking root that comes from a wild harvested area where it's really had to fight for its life. So when plants have to fight to grow, they tend to have more of their active phytochemicals, not phytochemicals, but they're
it's I mean phytochemicals, secondary metabolites, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, so they just have higher concentrations in their root systems and in their plants, their leaf material. So those are things to take into consideration. What are you growing for volume, or are you growing for value? And either one, you're going to be talking about, the time period it takes to have a harvestable crop. One of the things that you really, really need to consider when you're talking about these types of crops, these high value woodland crops, is security. There are a lot of cases where we have farmers who have planted a considerable amount of crop and then had it stolen off of their land. So that's an unfortunate side of things. There are a lot of wild harvesters out there that are actually over harvesting our native crops. And that's one of the reasons this forest farming initiative got started, was because those native wild populations were being depleted by these wild harvesters, because it's a high value crop, and you can get a couple $100 per pound if it's good quality, but it's being over harvested. And a lot of our medicinals are being over harvested. Goldenseal is another one. Goldenseal is a little bit easier to grow than ginseng, but obviously not as high a value, but still a very high value crop, and there are markets out there for it. So just like any crop that you're looking to plant, you want to make sure that you've identified the market you're going to sell into before you plant it. So learn the ins and outs of the market. You have to, in West Virginia, have a site visit before you're allowed to plant ginseng in your woods to identify whether or not you have whether or not you have native populations on your land, because they're wanting to prevent the cross-pollination of imported varieties. So out west, there's a couple varieties, but our Appalachian ginseng is slightly different, and so we're wanting to keep that pure. So what they're trying to do is come out, evaluate your property, find out if it's viable for ginseng, but also to see if you have any native population. So you do have to register to sell and grow ginseng.
Yeah, and let's talk a little bit more about the site selection you're talking about, because you did mention security in the site selection, and there are different things you can do to ensure you have a more secure area, that it works for you, and hopefully it'll pay off at harvest time. Whether that be years or months down the road, right? So, one of the recommendations are to choose planting sites close to your residence so that you're more easily able to look at the crop, make sure everything's okay, keep poachers out, right? Like you were saying.
Mm-hmm.
Be careful about who you say certain things to, right?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, don't tell your friends and family you're growing ginseng.
And I don't mean that to, it's just, and they might not even realize it's a valuable crop, and they turn around and talk about it with their friends, and before you know it, word's out, and somebody might get a little greedy. I hate to say it, but it is kind of something else to keep in mind when you're talking about site security and just crop security in general. But having it close to your residence does help with that deterrence of having poachers on your property, or at least poachers on the area that you are growing something valuable like that.
Yeah, and the community that grows these types of plants, they don't even use the word poaching. It's outright theft. The problem is that our laws haven't really caught up to this industry yet. They're still focused on wild harvesting, which is why that term is so ubiquitous. But it is outright theft. And so knowing the trespass laws of your state and properly signing your property, that's the key first step.
That's true.
And security cameras, thankfully, our security cameras now are very high quality, and they can have remote access, and you can hang it up in a tree. So there's a lot of things that have changed over the years that have helped to improve this.
That's true. And if you like to hunt, right, and you have hunting cameras, and they're suitable for things like ginseng growing, well, you might be okay there. You might be okay with multiple use of the land, and come season, you're going to be out there more more often than you would otherwise.
Yeah, yeah.
So another point that they were making about security site improvements are plant smaller plots over a larger area.
Yeah, spread them out. And if you do have high deer pressure, you are going to need to fence the deer out because they absolutely love these native plants, and they're going to come in and just devour your crop. They're one of the biggest pests. Chipmunks and voles also are a big pest when you're trying to grow these crops. And so there is actually grant money available to help you build fencing to protect these crops from predation by deer. So check out the website and see if you can't get a little bit more information on grant funding to help you maybe keep out the deer.
Oh dear, but yeah, and it's that's a tough one, especially I'm thinking like it's hard enough to keep deer out of crops when you're cultivating outside the woods where they don't live.
Mm-hmm.
Fencing and deer deterrence, whether it's noise, light, dogs, whatever it is. But in the woods, I mean, that's a tough one.
Yeah, so some of the things some people have done is they'll build little beds throughout their property, and they'll fence out just that little bed and keep animals out of that little area. Other things, they've fenced out the entire property. That's a little bit more expensive, but also very effective. But one of the things that you want to do is make sure that your property could even support these types of crops, before you get into it. And Virginia Tech actually just published this really great tool called PlantShoe, PlantShoe, like you wear on your foot.org. So plantshoe.org. And if you've ever used Web Soil Survey or Google Earth, you can draw a polygon around your property, and it will give you an analysis of that property as far as whether or not it's viable to grow things. And some of the things it looks at are aspect, elevation, slope, soil fertility, soil moisture, soil drainage, forest canopy, and it takes all of those things together and gives you a score as to whether or not it is a good site to grow the particular crops that you might be interested in growing. So most of these forest medicinal herbs and plants have similar needs. And so it's that north-facing slope, moist soils, and well-drained soils. There's also a couple other things, when you're out in your woods and you're walking around, look for sugar maples are a really good, what am I trying to say, co-planting.
Like indicator species?
Not necessarily an indicator species, but just a good plant to have this near.
Like a companion crop.
Companion crop, thank you. Yes, yes. So some species of trees have higher calcium exudates from their root system. And, when the trees send out these extra nutrients, they're a little bit more plant available than, say, if you're putting crushed eggshells on the ground. And so these plants particularly like hanging out with sugar maples. So when you're looking for a place to plant, you can look up above and see if you have a lot of sugar maples. And then that could be a secondary crop too. So if you have a lot of sugar maples, you could potentially tap those sugar maples for syrup, or just to sell the sap to a syrup producer that might be needing them. So if you don't want to do all the boiling and all that kind of thing, reach out to your local syrup producers and say, hey, if I tap these trees, would you want to buy the sap off of me? And, that might be another potential market opportunity for you. So a lot of potential for forest farming, but you do have to get a little bit of an idea of what your woods have in them and what your future plan for those woods are. So there are a lot of opportunities to make money from your woods. It shouldn't be just that forgotten area that you couldn't plow. It shouldn't be just the area around the riparian zone. It should be a potential for you to grow and diversify the products from your farm.
Right, and it should be more than just timber, the obvious one, right?
Yeah, and timber, especially in this area, you're talking about eastern hardwood forests, you may have 80 to 100 years between harvests. You may have 20 years to a harvest. You may be harvesting this year, but that turnaround time between harvests takes a while, especially if you're growing things like white oak. White oak is a really slow grower, and it's going to take a long time to get a timberable crop. Now, we definitely want it because our local brewing industry is taking off. Our local distilleries and whatnot, they need that white oak. So please I do encourage you to grow white oak, but on the right place, So like I said earlier in the show, you have your different parts of the woods are going to be better for different crops. And so just like you're analyzing your farm to which place is better for crops, which is better for livestock, and how are you going to rotate things around, think about that same topic in your woods and get a management plan for your woods that includes more than just timber and more than just wildlife, and try to think about those other opportunities.
Right. And let's talk about some of those crops. At least maybe we won't go into detail, but at least mention them so people are aware that these are the kinds of things that you can grow in the woods. So things like ramps, goldenseal, bloodroot. What was that one? Black
cohosh, blue cohosh,
American ginseng, which we've been talking about most of the show, because that's the one that, when we talk about something we produced in the woods, that's the one I think of.
Mm-hmm.
But there are all these other things too. They might be something that you're passionate about. And really, the secret to success is having that passion and market.
Right. And there's even things like mayapple. Mayapple we see all over the place. There's actually a market for that. Solomon's seal, fairy wand, false unicorn. For mushrooms, you could do shiitakes, maitakes, oysters, lion's mane, rishis, wine caps. You could do moss production, right? So let's say that you don't have much sunlight at all, but you have a lot of moss. You can do sheet moss or cushion moss, haircat moss, rock cat moss, not mosh. Fruits even, pawpaws are a forest species, right? Elderberries, blackberries, serviceberries, blueberries, huckleberries, wild plum. These are all things that grow in the woods. And then you even have nut production, right? You could have black walnut, shagbark hickory, beech, filberts, oak, acorns.
Right.
Acorn flower is growing in popularity, so that's an option. And then, of course, you have your vegetable crops, your ramps, your branch lettuce, your fiddleheads.
Yeah. And if you have a part of your forest that's rich in some kind of nut, like a black walnut or something, you can actually even select for the black walnut so that you are, opening up the area for black walnut production. So just different ways of doing things.
Yeah, there's a lot of opportunities available, and find a forester, work with them, get a forest management plan, but talk to them and tell them that you're really interested in the understory and you'd like to learn more about forest farming. And please, if you are interested in this, check out the Appalachian Beginning Forest Farmer Coalition. They have a lot of great programs, a lot of great connections. Join their newsletter. You can reach out to me with questions or any of your extension agents, and they can get you connected. Again, it's the Appalachian Beginning Forest Farmer Coalition, and there's a lot of great opportunities out there for your woods. Thanks for listening to Extension Calling. This show is a collaboration between OSU Belmont County Extension Educator Dan Lima and WVU Ohio County Extension Agent Karen Cox. If you'd like a transcript of this show, contact us at the office. Also, let us know if you enjoy the show by ranking us on your podcast app.